Hello and welcome to the last podcast of 2021 from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month is Jean-Luc Racine, who's Emeritus Director of Research at the French National Centre for Scientific Research and a Senior Fellow at the Asia Centre in Paris. Jean-Luc has a piece in this month's edition of the paper entitled Taliban Victory Sparks Regional Reset. In it, he looks at some of the consequences for Afghanistan's neighbours of the US's military withdrawal in late August this year. One narrative has it that Pakistan is the big winner now the Taliban are back, and India the big loser. But as you'll hear, the picture is much more complex than that. For a start, all of Afghanistan's neighbours, including Pakistan, Russia, which has no direct border with Afghanistan, and China, fear a spillover effect from a range of extremist groups, including the regional ISIS affiliate, Islamic State Khorasan Province. A region with multiple pressure points and contested sovereignties once again has a markedly unstable state in its midst. The map accompanying Jean-Luc's article makes clear Afghanistan's geographical centrality in the region. It's unignorable in any account of regional power dynamics. And early in his piece, he mentions the Great Game, the 19th century struggle for dominance in Central Asia, played out by Russia and Britain. When I spoke to him recently, I began by asking him to reflect on Afghanistan's continuing importance in the region.
Yes, there is indeed a change from the old Great Game, but basically, and I'm not at all deterministic, but history and geography, of course, are relevant in the case. Afghanistan is just the kind of meeting point of Central Asia, West Asia, and more particularly the legacy of the old Persian Empire and Iran of today, and what's called now South Asia. And when we see how history has developed on the one hand, and what's the linguistic map of Afghanistan today, we see that Pashtuns, which are the most important part of the ethnic map, goes much beyond the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the old Durand Line drawn in 1893 during the Great Game, precisely. And this explains also why in the former tribal areas of Pakistan, I say former because their status has changed recently, you have exactly the same ethnicity. You have the same Pashtun, and you have the same Pashtun in what was the old British frontier province of Northwest. On the other hand, if you are in Herat, in the east of the country, Herat was a part of the Persian dynasties, and still now, culturally speaking, it's very close to the Iranian culture. The language is basically the same. And if we go to the north, the Tajik, the Uzbek, the Turkmen of Afghanistan, as the name suggests, I mean, that's the same people that was in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. So I will not say that it's really a melting pot, but clearly, if there is a place which deserves the name to be there, between empires or between power today, it's Afghanistan. And it's not just, in a way, of course, every country is between this and that. But here it's between what was formerly empires and what are still, in a way, civilization. And that explains also why, beyond the relevance of geography, it's a land of mountains, some rich valleys, but also of desert. And you don't need the French to recall the British that the Anglo-Afghan wars of 19th century were not very pleasant. So there is this legacy, which is both due to the location and the geographical pattern of the country, on the one hand, and importantly as well, the ethnic diversity, with the subdivision between ethnic groups, with clans and that. And here the Afghan history is a testimony to the fact that division and infighting between various ethnicities has been a part of the history.
So that's a really good introduction to the terrain. And what I wanted to move on to do is to look at some of how the regional powers are responding to the return of the Taliban, in particular India and Pakistan, and we'll come on to China. And I thought maybe we could begin with India, because India had invested a lot of money in infrastructure in Afghanistan, and it had developing relationships with the former Afghan government. It didn't have relationships with the Taliban. And of course, India has a long-standing rivalry with Pakistan and sees Pakistan as being in an enhanced position with the return of the Taliban. So I wondered if you could talk first about how India has been viewing the return of the Taliban and how it's been responding. And of course, Kashmir is a sort of very important flashpoint in that context.
Yes, indeed. It's a very long history of relationship between what's today Afghanistan and what's today India. And it's not just a question of what was called Indo-Persian culture. I mean, we may remember that the first Greek Mughal, Babur, was coming from Kabul, and that centuries before him, the greatest Indian empire of antiquity, the Maurya Empire, incorporated part of Afghanistan. But today, of course, the story is quite different because of a partition of British India in 1947 at the time of independence. When the Raj left, he left behind two countries, which means that the border with Afghanistan was now the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that explained, particularly after the second partition of the subcontinent, when Bangladesh rise against Pakistan, that the very difficult relationship between India and Pakistan remain, of course, to these days. In fact, it's also for trying to make sure that in the confused time, in the quasi-anarchy, that the infighting Mujahideen, which have chased the Soviets out of Afghanistan, seen from Islamabad, and it was Benazir Bhutto at that time, someone who, of course, was not a kind of radical Islamist, but who has some sort of geopolitical vision, who decided that it was time to try to make Afghanistan safe. And this is how some of Taliban, they were not yet called Taliban at that time, who near Kandahar decided to fight for their own ideas, were promoted in a way in the Pakistani madrasas, hence the name of Taliban, the student, for asserting against India, asserting the interest of Pakistan. I mean, the key point, of course, for Islamabad, and it's still true today, is not to be taken into pincer between India on one hand and the pro-Indian government in Kabul. So that's explained why India, after the fall of the Taliban regime, before that, India was close to Commandant Massoud. But after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, India made a point to engage with the new government of Hamid Karzai, and it was carried on with the government of Ashraf Ghani. India invested almost $3 billion in infrastructure, in symbolic buildings such as the new parliament building in Kabul. We have to look at all that, of course, always with a confrontation between India and Pakistan on the one hand, and as you mentioned, the question of Kashmir, the disputed territory between India and Pakistan. And when you look at the map, the north of Kashmir, under Pakistani administration but contested by India, is very close to Afghanistan. There is just the Chitral areas between the two. So for India, there was, of course, there is still the memory that the jihadi group, which has emerged in Pakistan for fighting against India in Kashmir, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Jaish particularly, the leader of the Jaish, has been trained in Afghanistan under the Taliban. So for India, there is a serious concern that the Taliban coming back to power might, in a way, favor a kind of revival of these jihadi groups, which are supposed to be more or less controlled by Pakistan. But the fact that Pakistan has given some signal about this group is not taken very seriously in New Delhi, and there is so a serious concern. There is also a dimension that we can quickly underline, is that as Pakistan has prohibited Indian trade by land route to Afghanistan, they just make an exception for eventually sending humanitarian aid to Afghanistan those days. But India has just sent aid by plane, in fact, to Afghanistan. But as traditionally India cannot cross by land Pakistan for reaching Afghanistan, there was the initiative to build up, to develop with Iran the Iranian port of Chabahar, close to the Pakistani border, as a way to enter Afghanistan through Iran. And today, one of the points, of course, is to see what will happen to this initiative, which may interest, but that's another story, which may interest another neighbor of Afghanistan, which is China.
We'll definitely come on to talk about China, but let's stay with Pakistan for the moment. And a journalist writing in the Pakistani daily newspaper Dawn wrote recently that Pakistan won the Afghan war. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that. Can you say some of the ways in which it's a lot more complicated than simply Pakistan has won?
Yes, of course. And he's not wrong, but it's not true as well. But it's more intricate. And a former Pakistani ambassador to the US, who is now living in the US, wrote that it might be the victory of Taliban. It might be a Pyrrhus victory for Islamabad. Why? Because Pakistan has to face its own brand of Taliban. The Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, which aggregated various groups which emerged in those former tribal areas close to the Afghanistan border, a place which have seen all sorts of militants, Al-Qaeda, Uyghurs, and of course Taliban after their defeat in 2001, when Pakistan decided to welcome the Taliban leader in the so-called Quetta Shura, Quetta, the main city of Pakistani Balochistan, and the militants were there in the tribal areas. And all this mix of radical militants pushed some sort of social upheaval against the traditional leadership in the tribal areas of Pakistan, and emerged from this mix the Pakistani Taliban. And the Pakistani Taliban have a goal, which is to pull down the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which they consider not to be really Islamic. That's always the old story. Who is the real Islamist or not? So for Pakistan, the key question was, with the Taliban back to power, okay, the Indians are now no more a problem for us, but we must be sure that the Afghan Taliban don't promote their brother from across the Durand line. And this is why, in fact, Imran Khan, who has always been ready in opposition or in power to discuss with radicals, has decided to engage the Pakistani Taliban, which has been crushed in 2015 by the Pakistani army after daring to launch a bloody attack on a military school in Peshawar with more than 100 kids killed by those Taliban. So they were crushed. Part of them crossed the border, of course, to Afghanistan. Some of them joined Daesh, the Islamic State in Khorasan. And after being crushed, they have revived in a way in 2020, launching new attacks against the Shia minority, against some Pakistani force. And we have seen, so during the last few weeks, the Afghan Taliban playing the role of mediation between the Pakistani government and the Pakistani Taliban. A ceasefire has been agreed for 1 month, but after the end of the 1 month, the Pakistani Taliban say enough is enough. We don't prorogate the ceasefire. So there is still a problem. And there is another problem, of course, for Pakistan, not perhaps for the government, but for a number of observers, which say, well, I mean, we have a number of extremists, not necessarily Pakistani Taliban. We should be aware of the fact that the success of the Taliban can, in a way, give a push to all sorts of radical extremists, the so-called Deobandis, yes, but also the Barelvi, and we have seen all this agitation about the blasphemy case in Pakistan. So, yes, there is some concern in Islamabad. We have to see how all this will develop in the future.
And that fear of sort of terrorism reaching across borders, of the sort of contamination effect, the emboldening effect that you've just described, is not just experienced in India and Pakistan. All of Afghanistan's neighbours have that fear of some kind of extremism, of radicalisation spreading from Afghanistan, including Russia, which isn't even a direct neighbour of Afghanistan. But as you said at the beginning, those Central Asian republics are, and Russia has fears of instability on its doorstep, doesn't it? So that's something which all of the regional powers share, is this fear of the contamination of extremism, the spread of extremism.
Yes, it's absolutely a crucial point. We may remember that when the Americans signed an agreement with the Taliban political office in Doha, in Qatar, in 2020, one of the points that the Taliban engaged themselves was that Afghanistan should not become again a kind of platform for jihadi groups, and particularly international jihadi groups. Today they say, don't be concerned, this is not a problem. Yes, there have been some attacks, but it's under control. It's not exactly the view of a UN observer who consider that there is still links with Al-Qaeda. We may remember, in fact, that there were family links between the Al-Qaeda leadership and the Taliban, both in Afghanistan and in the troubled area of Pakistan. But most importantly today, all the neighbors, as you said, are very concerned about the risk of a kind of revival of Al-Qaeda, but more importantly, perhaps, a kind of expansion of Daesh in its local branch, its local province, which is the Islamic State of Khorasan, the old name of Afghanistan and the surrounding areas. So for the Chinese, of course, it's a concern about the Islamic Party of Turkestan the new name of Uyghur radical Muslim separatists who have been for long in the Badakhshan province of Afghanistan. It seems that the Taliban have now relocated themselves a little further from the China border, but for Beijing, of course, it's something absolutely decisive. For Moscow, which has been very active diplomatically, trying to promote some sort of a solution through diplomacy, for Moscow, the big concern is, and it's a concern shared by the Central Asian Republic, that the local groups, and particularly the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, who historically had long links with the Taliban. There were some Uzbek in the guards around Mullah Omar, for instance. And the concern is that those all militant groups, and as far as the Uzbek are concerned, some of them have gone fighting in Syria and have come back. The concern is that, in a way, the Islamic State of Khorasan might give a new push to old movement in the region. And so for Russia and the Central Asian Republic, the key question is to be sure that Daesh, the Islamic State in Khorasan, could be crushed or at least controlled. And this is where the discourse of Islamic Emirates, as the Taliban call themselves, is not very convincing when they constantly say, don't be bothered, everything is under control. And then we have Iran. And Iran, of course, is concerned with the fate of Shia minorities, particularly targeted by Daesh. There have been horrible attacks against Shia in a maternity hospital and in girls' college in Kabul during the last few years. And there is also for Iran, of course, a concern about Sunni majority, the separatist Sunni majority in the Iranian Balochistan, which is close to Afghanistan. So everyone has something to fear as far as terrorism is concerned.
You write in your article, Jean-Luc, that one difference between the great game in the 19th century and the present situation is that China in the 19th century was not a strong power, and today it is clearly a preeminent power in the region. And you mentioned the security concerns that China has. China also has potential economic interests in how Afghanistan develops. So I wondered, what can you say about how China is currently thinking about Afghanistan and what kind of relationship it might have with the Taliban regime?
So first, of course, and contrary to India, and similarly to Iran and to Russia, China has discussed with the Taliban. They have even invited the Taliban. And as you know, in diplomacy, there are various ways to behave. But when you have an official photograph with Mullah Baradar, who was at that time the head of the political office of the Taliban in Doha and who is now deputy prime minister, an official photo of Mullah Baradar with Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, it sent a signal. So they took care to not be cut from the Taliban, but was the same policy when the Taliban was in power after 1996. Why? First, of course, for some reason of security that have been mentioned about the peril of Uyghur insurgency, but also, and particularly under Xi Jinping and his mega infrastructure project of a new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. For China, Afghanistan is interesting precisely because of this central position between various Central Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and China. As you know, one of the key elements of Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which provide through Pakistan an access from Xinjiang in China, so Western China, to the Arabian Sea, very close to the Persian Gulf. So there are some hypotheses about having an extension from the Pakistani corridor to Afghanistan, from the east to the west. But there is also a project of building a railway in Afghanistan close to the border with Central Asia in order to link China through Central Asia, through Afghanistan to Iran. And we have to remember that not long ago, a few months ago, China and Iran signed a 25-year agreement, which is in a way a kind of strategic partnership. So Afghanistan is important for China on connectivity issue, but it's also important by itself, if I may say so. Poor Afghanistan is in fact a rich country in minerals. China has invested, not really invested, but have signed a contract with what's supposed to be the second greatest copper mine in the world, close to Kabul, but they have done nothing because of security. And it's still now, they have sent some observer to see how the situation can develop, but there are so many mineral riches in Afghanistan that, of course, China cannot forget that, particularly with something as strategic as lithium, which is the key of electric car, the key of telephone. And they have sent, in fact, here again, observer to see, is it possible to start and when will it be possible to invest in Afghanistan? So security, connectivity, Afghan resources. So it's not astonishing, of course, to find China in the rank of the countries which are not recognizing the new Taliban regime. No one has done that for the time being, but which plead for discussing with them. They may say for humanitarian reasons, but in fact also there is a point shared by many countries around Afghanistan who plead for Washington and the White House and the State Department to free the some $10 billion frozen by Washington in the US. In fact, it's official Afghan funding, which has been secured in American bank. And we have learned this morning, in fact, that Washington is still saying no. And at a time when Afghanistan is facing a terrible humanitarian crisis, and the UN has sent a number of warnings. They are trying what they can for providing help. But here again, the question of sending help to Afghanistan cannot be disconnected from the big geopolitics.
Yes. And at the end of your article, you write about the situation in Afghanistan being a sort of sign of the transition to a multipolar order that we're seeing. And you talk about the emergence of an informal quad consisting of China, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. And I wanted to, in conclusion, ask you about the nature of that quad and what kind of role you think it might play in the regional order that is emerging from the old one.
So, of course, that's the most difficult question to answer, because it's something, another quad question mark was an analysis provided by some Indian observers. And it's not by chance that it's where Indian observers who were a bit concerned with that. Really, it's a very complicated word, you know. India is concerned also by the fact that Russia is coming closer to China, and we know that India-China relationship are really on the down after the clashes on the Himalayan border last year. This has not prevented Vladimir Putin to come to India early December and to launch a 2+2 dialogue between the two countries. There is Russia, India, China structure with annual meeting of foreign minister, but this so-called CRIP, which is not really a quad, but we may remember that the classic quads are in the Indo-Pacific with US, Japan, India, and Australia, was something a bit informal at the beginning, starting with high-ranking officers, but then going up to the level of foreign minister and finally going up to the level of head of state and government. We are not yet, of course, on this scenario for the so-called CRIP, but of course, and there is a structure of neighbors of Afghanistan which preempt the return of the Taliban to power. And Iran was organizing this meeting recently, and there are also the neighbors, which include Central Asian Republic, Pakistan, and China, plus Russia, even if Russia is not technically an immediate neighbor. So let's simply say that it's something that we may perhaps keep an eye on. It's too early for saying that, yes, something new is emerging. But of course, even if Pakistan is balancing between the old links with the US and its closer link with China, a kind of common denominators to this group would be its opposition, particularly from Russia, from China, from Iran, the opposition to Washington. So let's see how all this will develop. And once again, the long Afghan history of intricacies is born to not to end soon.
I was speaking to Jean-Luc Racine, who has an article entitled Taliban Victory Sparks Regional Reset in the December 2021 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. You can read it at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years, as well as exploring other resources, such as the podcast archive and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.